Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know a few folks are still joining the webinar. My name is Kendra Strauss. I'm going to be moderating today, and I'm going to start us off with a few introductions and a bit of information about the structure of an organization of the webinar. So welcome to Should a Just Recovery Include a Basic Income for BC? I want to start by acknowledging that the three campuses of Simon Fraser University reside on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Quaiquet, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples. Obviously, with the recent discoveries of unmarked graves in Kamloops and now outside Regina, it's even more incumbent on us, especially those of us like myself who are settlers and uninvited guests on these lands, to remember that when we talk about questions of income, wealth, and the economy, that wealth in our economy comes from stolen and unceded lands and dispossession of Indigenous peoples in this country we call Canada. This webinar is one in a series hosted by the Labor Studies program at SFU. This series has focused on the question of what a just recovery might look like. And so today's topic is, should a just recovery include a basic income for BC? I want to acknowledge and thank SFU Public Square for co-sponsoring this event today. And what we're going to be focusing on today is a discussion of the final report of the British Columbia Expert Panel on Basic Income. This webinar series is sponsored by the Labor Studies program and the SFU Morgan Center for Labor Research. And so given the length and breadth and depth of the report, which for those of you who've read it or read parts of it is over 500 pages, we won't be able to cover every topic included in the report today. And in particular, we're going to focus on some of the implications of the discussion in the report, the analysis, and its recommendations for workers in BC. I just wanted to mention that we do have another webinar, probably the final webinar before the summer, coming up in July, which will focus on the current contract worker justice campaign at SFU. That webinar will be co-organized with Community Engaged Research Initiative, CERI. So if you're interested, please do subscribe to our Eventbrite page to be kept up to date with future events. So I just want to quickly mention the sort of rules of engagement for today. Because this is a Zoom webinar, attendees, all of you who are signed in and participating today will be automatically muted and have your cameras turned off. The chat is disabled for participants, but we really do encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A function. You can do so at any time. We will have time for discussion after our panelists speak today, and I will moderate the questions. We do have over 200 people registered for our webinar today, so we probably will not be able to get to everyone's question. If we don't get to your question, I do apologize, but I do encourage everyone to submit questions and to submit them at any time during the panelists' comments. The webinar will be recorded. Sorry, I moved my mouse there. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be made available through the Labor Studies Program YouTube channel. We will let participants know when that link is available. So, for if you have friends or colleagues who were interested but not able to attend, they will be able to watch the recording later. And, if you're willing, we always welcome feedback on our webinars, and you'll have an opportunity to do so after. We'll send you a link after the webinar. So as I mentioned, I'm the moderator today. I'm the director of the Labor Studies program here at SFU. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and an associate member in the Geography department. I am myself a feminist political economist, and I do research on labor and regulation, social reproduction, and migration in BC and in Canada more broadly. So the topic today is one that's very much of interest to me and close to my heart. So I'm just going to start by briefly introducing our panelists. We're very lucky to be joined by three people with deep connections to and experience of the labor market and labor market issues in British Columbia. David Greene is a professor in the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC. He received his BA from Queen's University and his PhD from Stanford, and his areas of research include income inequality, immigration, impacts of technical and technological change on the labor market, and other policies affecting labor market incomes. He's also the former editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics. He's an international research associate with the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London and a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David was also the chair of the Basic Income Panel during the period that it did its work. Caitlin Michulowicz is the executive director of the Worker Solidarity Network based in Victoria, but serving all of BC, and which was formerly known as the Retail Action Network. Caitlin is the co-chair of the BC Employment Standards Coalition and comes to her organizing work with 7 years of experience working in restaurants. After getting tired of managers telling her to dress classy provocative, which probably sounds familiar to many of us who've worked in the restaurant industry, Caitlin joined a community of workers to fight for fair and decent working conditions in BC. We're also lucky to have Chuka Ejekam join us today. Chuka is Director of the Research and Policy at the BC Federation of Labour and a research associate with the BC Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He holds a bachelor's degree in rhetoric from the University of Winnipeg and a combined bachelor's in political science and philosophy from UBC. He's also currently enrolled in a master's degree program in political science at UBC with academic research focusing on reparative drug policy, structural racism, and political and economic inequality. His work at the BC Federation of Labour focuses on the changing world of work, including deindustrialization, precarious employment, automation and AI, and climate change. So the order in which I introduced our panelists is also the order in which they are going to speak today. They will speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we will have time for questions. So I am going to now turn it over to David Greene as our first speaker.
Thanks very much, Kendra. My video kept going on and off there for a second. Thanks very much for having me and for everyone for participating, for taking part. Really appreciate this opportunity. As Kendra said, I was the chair of the panel. I was only the chair because apparently all panels have to have chairs. It was really actually quite an equal structure. So the other panel members are Lindsay Tedds, who's at University of Calgary, and Reese Kusselman, who's from SFU. We were also given Dan Perrin to, I think, kind of watch over us to some degree, but it turned out that Dan had deep knowledge about many of the things we were looking at. And so really this is actually a report co-authored by all four of us. The mandate of our panel was to investigate the question whether a basic income should be a central policy for British Columbia, and if not a basic income, how would one think about reforming the system that we have with basic income principles in mind? We worked on this for 2.5 years. We commissioned over 40 studies You can see all of those studies and the final report on our website, bcbasicincompanel.ca. We also benefited from quite extensive engagement, some of it that we did ourselves directly, and some benefiting from the fact that the start of our panel, we overlapped for a while with the Poverty Reduction Committee, who had done over 8,000 interviews talking to people directly affected by all of these policies. One of the things that sometimes comes up, this is back to what Kendra was talking about before, is a question that's put to us, which is if we're focusing on what look like income redistribution type of policies, like basic income or income assistance in the current system, how is it that we ended up with emphasis as well on labor-related issues? That came about partly because the way we framed our whole report and our approach was to keep in front of us the question, would this particular policy make BC a more just society? And by more just, we meant the standard we were using was a notion of justice that involves the bases of self-respect and social respect for everyone. As soon as you define that, it becomes pretty immediately obvious that there's no way you're going to avoid thinking about labor market issues. That's partially because we all spend so much of our time at work, whether paid or not work. So whatever happens there, whatever happens in those relations is going to be definitional for the justice of a society. It's partially because we get our notions of self-respect and social respect from our work relations to some degree. And then third, and a little less in our sort of mindset, there is important interactions between income support systems and the labor market. There's important questions about if you're designing a system that's really a last resort system from crappy jobs, that's a very different outlook from saying if we're really going to go in and try to affect the nature of jobs, try to make sure that good jobs are available, that'll change the behavior pretty strongly. One of the other things that comes up is that one of the main rationales put forward for the basic income comes out of Silicon Valley, which is a notion that the combination of like AI, robotics, and web-based apps like Uber are going to mean either the end of work or that we're all going to end up in Uber-type gig work relationships. We spent a fair bit of time looking at that, and we argue that there's not great evidence of really strong trends in those directions, certainly not the end of work. I'll sort of qualify that statement in a moment. And that's important in our mind because the sort of Silicon Valley take is a very technologically deterministic take, right? It essentially says AI, an engineer can think up how workers are going to be replaced and therefore it will happen. But if you just recognize that the phone you're using is not being built in a hermetically sealed plant by robots, which it could almost certainly be at this point, it's being built by low-wage labor, then you start to recognize that what technologies are implemented, how they interact with workers, even what's invented is a complicated process that is amenable to policy reaction. And that was part of the big point that we wanted to push. We have the ability to affect this part of our society for sure. Even with that said, there are obviously key, I don't mean in any way to minimize issues in the labor market. As I said, even if there's not big trends in those directions in some of the measures, like for example, own account self-employment, there are very great reasons for concern. Leah Bosco at University of Toronto talks about us being in a situation of persistent precarity, where we've got about a third of our workers who are in some of these sort of officially designated precarious states. But even underlying that, at the same time, as everybody here knows, there's an ongoing long-term decline in unionization. And there's evidence, although it's a little hard, a little more indirect to look at, of increased in fissured work, where fissured work is a term that's used to describe work relations that have come to the fore or had light shone on them in COVID. So for example, the women, because it's mostly women, in fact, mostly racialized women, who are working in long-term care facilities worked not for the long-term care facilities themselves, but for these intermediate firms. And that kind of fissured work relationship, there's empirical evidence showing it reduces wages, but it also means that workers are less likely to be to have employment standards actually effectively enforced for them. And so part of our report was about recommendations in both those areas, collective bargaining and these sort of issues about who is an employee, how do we define who an employee is. I'm not going to go into those specific recommendations right now. I think Caitlin's going to talk about some of them and possibly Chuka as well. I really mostly want to point out one of our sort of overall big recommendations, which is that we believe the government should be taking all the governments should be taking an active role in answering these questions. They should be defining who is an employee rather than waiting for either the courts or say the labor relations tribunals to make those choices. These are choices about what we want society to look like, what we owe to each other. If we want work relationships that are respectful while trying to figure out how to bring flexibility for those who want it, that's a discussion we should be having in the open very actively. And let me just finally say, this is another sort of point in the report. Often all of these kinds of discussions, we end up sort of in the weeds. We end up talking about the very clearly important details of policies. But I think it's important to recognize that policies on this scale change the society and to define the society we want. A basic income, for example, puts a lot of emphasis on autonomy and independence of the individual as the key thing that we're after in our policy making. In the labor market context, that means that doing things like getting dignified workplaces is hoped to arise by giving people a basic income, a backstop. And then based on that, the idea is they'd be able to walk away from bad jobs. And while there is some empirical evidence that happens, it's a very indirect way to go at this issue. And it creates a society that puts a lot of emphasis on money and working with markets. And as I said, I think those are things that we should be debating rather than accepting, and make sure that we keep those in mind while we're talking about the details of policy. I think I'll stop there, Kendra, if that's okay.
That's great. It's just taking me a minute. I'm also experiencing a little bit of delay with turning my camera on and off. So thank you, David. I'm going to pass over to Caitlin now.
Great, thank you, Kendra. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the panel organizers, and thank you all out there in the Zoom world participating in the webinar today. With much gratitude, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen people, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And in this moment, my heart is very heavy and my thoughts are with the many residential school survivors, their families, and their communities. The Worker Solidarity Network is a nonprofit worker center dedicated to ending precarious work in BC. And the WSN is also a member of the BC Employment Standards Coalition, which I have the pleasure of co-chairing this year, which is comprised of diverse organizations and individuals that come together to develop and advocate for model legislation to improve the Employment Standards Act. And today I'll be speaking to the report's recommendations concerning improving employment and labor relations law and policy. And the report shows us that precarious work is a persistent problem. And like David has just suggested, rather than posing basic income as the solution to addressing precarious work, it suggests that the better policy response is to support people doing precarious work by improving employment standards in labor relations. And these recommendations are set out in numbers 44 to 51, which I'll talk on a few of them today. But very quickly, precarious work deserves our attention for many reasons. And one of them is because women, racialized workers, people with insecure or temporary immigration status, as well as people with disabilities, are more likely to be in poorly paid, part-time, and insecure precarious work. And I just wanted to note at the outset that unfortunately, I think some of the data from the basic income report that relies on the labor force survey is a bit limited in capturing this and giving a really complex portrait of precarious work. that we've seen in other research. It doesn't capture the proportion of racialized workers or Indigenous workers or workers with disability who are in forms of precarious work. But what I did find curious and also maybe even concerning about the data, the important data from the report, is the differences it showed in comparing BC with Canada overall when it came to different work arrangements. For example, when it comes to the proportion of workers who are in full-time stable employment, workers in BC are doing a lot worse than workers in the rest of Canada overall, especially women workers. So why do employment standards matter before I get into those recommendations? So having a legislated work standards reflects the idea that working conditions shouldn't fall below a standard that's allowed by a decent society. Employment standards set a floor of rights, and they address the imbalance of power that exists within an employment relationship. And most employees in BC rely on employment standards to create their conditions of work because about 70% of workers in BC aren't unionized. And currently our employment standards are failing. They do not provide decent work. They create precarious work counter to the decent work agenda of the ILO. And the ILO describes decent work as work involving opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace and social protections for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns at work, to organize and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and the equality of opportunity and treatment for workers. And in BC, we've seen a weakening of labor rights significantly in the early 2000s. And there's nothing natural or inevitable about precarious work. It's designed to be this way. Between 2002 and 2004, in the name of modernizing BC's Employment Standards Act, and without a public review, the Liberal government made 40+ changes, drastic changes to the Employment Standards Act and its enforcement. They also changed the labor code as well and introduced or reintroduced the secret ballot certification vote system for workers trying to unionize. And some things have changed since in the last few years with the current government, like eliminating the self-help kit, but there's still lots more that needs to be done. And one of these areas that requires work is exclusions. So in the report, recommendation 45 calls on the government to review the current employment standards exclusions to create clear principles for exclusions. And the basic income report, unfortunately, isn't the first review to call on the government to do this as well, but other reviews, including the Fair Wages Commission, the 1994 review of the employment standards, the 2018 review of the BC Law Institute, has called on the government to review the exclusions, and they have failed to do so. And last month, the Employment Standards Coalition sent a submission to Minister Harry Bains urging them to establish an independent commission to review these exclusions. There's a long list, over 100 exclusions, most of which have been in place for decades. And these exclusions are a problem because it means employers can avoid paying overtime, vacation pay, stat holiday pay, severance pay, and even minimum wage. They essentially create gaps in what is supposed to be a floor of rights. There's two main types of exclusions, one being that people are excluded entirely from the Employment Standards Act because of a type of profession. David mentioned even the question of who is an employee, who counts as an employee is really relevant here. Another type of exclusions are when folks are excluded from parts of the Act. So right now in British Columbia, farm workers are excluded from protections that regulate hours of work, overtime pay, and statutory holiday pay, including farm workers who are hand harvesters and harvest fruit trees, berries, vegetables. They're excluded from the regular minimum wage and instead given the piece rate. And this is very, very problematic and is a form of systemic racism because almost all hand harvesters are racialized recent immigrants, largely South Asian immigrants. The report also calls on government to improve employment standards overall and improve their application. And I want to just kind of zoom in here and talk a little bit about hours of work and why introducing improvements to the hours of work is so important, and also paid sick leave if I have time. So the ESA regulates hours of work. It was significantly weakened by the Liberals in the 2000s and hasn't since been improved by this government. Employers have significant control over scheduling and work hours, which means that in practice, they can use just-in-time staffing practices that give employees little or zero security and gives employers great flexibility, meaning that in the end, workers shoulder the cost of this. Without scheduling security, there can be no economic security for people in work. So some of the recommendations around this that the Employment Standards Coalition has called on government to introduce in the last review of employment standards include giving workers advance notice of their schedules, posting schedules 2 weeks in advance. Right now, and including the start time and the end time to shifts. So right now, employers can post schedules last minute. Shifts are open-ended, which makes navigating life, planning childcare, navigating multiple jobs extremely difficult. There's also no penalty on employers who cancel shifts, right up until the hour before a shift. And there's a lot of other challenges there that I don't have time to go into. Another major way that employment standards need to be improved is by providing permanent paid sick leave. We right now have 3 temporary days that expire in December, but employees in BC need, at least 10 permanent paid sick days and additional days for future pandemics as well. And this is an issue that disproportionately impacts low-wage workers. Research from Kendra Strauss and Iglika Ivanova show us that almost 90%, 89% of workers earning under $30,000 a year in BC don't have employer paid sick days. And we know that many of these are in jobs where racialized workers and women are more likely to be found. And recommendation 46 of the report importantly draws government's attention to concerns around the proactive enforcement of employment standards. Employment standards really are just words on paper unless there's a strong employer compliance. And a reactive, complaints-driven model of enforcing employment standards means that enforcement largely falls on the shoulders of workers. The Employment Standards Branch resources were significantly cut back in the early 2000s. More resources are needed, random audits are needed, employers and industries known to be regular violators are also needed. And finally, recommendation 48 calls on the government to investigate options for increasing workers' access to unionization. Precarious work, the gig economy, the platform economy, the fishing of work firms, is a huge problem. Because there are many barriers, structural barriers and challenges that people in these forms of work face when it comes to unionization. And eliminating the secret ballot vote that was reintroduced by the Liberals in the early 2000s would, which invites employer interference in the certification process, would make unionizing, the right that workers have to unionizing, more accessible. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I think Caitlin's comments raised some really interesting questions, as David alluded to, between, about whether a basic income has the purported possible effect of increasing worker power, or whether it solely addresses the wage, which, as important as it might be, does not necessarily reflect some of these broader dimensions of the imbalance between worker power relative to employers. So I'm now going to pass over to Chuka.
Thank you, Kendra, and Caitlin and David. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I too share Caitlin's horror at the recent discoveries. So I wanted to talk a bit about recommendation number 49, which is regarding the prior proposal, the proposal put forward in the 2018 review of labor regulations in the province, which recommended that the government pursue proactively facilitating industry advisory councils. I'm going to talk a bit about some corollaries for this, examples of institutions like this in Europe, and what some of the considerations could be, and fundamentally how we could think about that proposal in the context of the power relationship between workers as employers, as Caitlin and Kendra just identified. So I think the first question would be to ask why industry advisory councils or institutions like them would be important. Why is something like that a meaningful proposal? I think it's notable that we dedicate most of our waking lives to work. Depending on your commute and some specifics about your how often you work overtime, what your weekends are like, you may spend more if you discount time spent sleeping, you may spend more time at work or working than you do with your family or loved ones, which of course is significant considering we have but one life. Some would defend and so given that we spend so much time there and we dedicate so much of our lives to work, it is notable that workplaces are fundamentally anti-democratic. As a worker, in most cases, you have very little agency or power in the workplace. Unions, of course, are an attempt to address that, but they're reflective of that reality that workers have very, very little power in comparison to employers. Some would defend that inequity by saying that employers or business owners, they have the right to have more power because they've either taken the risk, quote unquote, or they have they've earned the resources. And so, and I don't think either of those are compelling arguments. One, because obviously meritocracy is a myth. I don't have to recount why that is. I'm sure all of us are familiar. But then two, of course, the global distribution of wealth and resources and well-being of resource and opportunity and well-being has been structured by colonization and genocide and slavery and other expressions of violent white supremacy. So it's not the case that that somebody who has enough money or capital or whatever it may be to invest, to start a business, to employ people, it's certainly not necessarily the case that they have done something to deserve that, or even that position can rightfully be earned. So for all of those reasons, we have a circumstance that is defined by inequality of power and wealth, and in which power and wealth were not distributed equally, let alone equitably. And I think on that alone, that requires that the circumstance be upended, but then the outcomes of that circumstance, the increasing of wealth and income inequality, the increasing of harm experienced by people who have been historically excluded from opportunities for well-being or security, those increase the urgency with which we have to upend that system. So having got to that point, what are some other examples of similar institutions that do exist? I think a significant example are works councils and European works councils that exist within the EU. Work councils would be at the state level, so member states would have their local work councils, and then the EU, through a legislation I believe advanced in 2001 that brought them together, it created a second strata of European works councils in which worker representatives from each of the member states will convene with employer representatives from each of the member states in the auspices of the European Union itself. In fact, while this legislation is bold in a number of ways. While this isn't the case for the state level works councils, at the international level, a company cannot be, if I understand it correctly, a company cannot be registered with the European Union officially unless it has identified one of the two available models for forming a works council within its organization. Those are, the first is that workers would take direct seats on boards or in ownership, and the other is that workers would develop their own separate institution, which is then necessarily consulted by the employer. Just somewhat as a side note, I think that first model is interesting in that it's not that far from the inclusive ownership fund that was proposed by the UK Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. The inclusive ownership fund was a bit more aggressive and had increasing ownership, but I think that it's interesting that there aren't that many distinctions, or that there are some similarities. I think that's notable. The inclusive ownership fund, it also included the sharing of dividends, which is not something that's required by works councils, but theoretically, I guess, could be argued for. Although exactly how the deliberations work between works councils and employers is something I'm not entirely certain of. Just one state level example that I think is interesting before I'll go on to the sort of final wrap up is in Germany, works councils were, in Germany, when they were initially introduced in, I believe, the 1920s, the unions in Germany were very wary of works councils because they feared that it would offer employers a way to negotiate or to address workers or negotiate with workers without going through official collective bargaining. They avoided that outcome by developing clear responsibilities, delineating the line between responsibilities for the union and the council. But actually, as time has gone on and union membership in Germany has begun to decline, German unions have looked at works councils as a way to promote unionization by organizing workers. So I think, again, that's sort of notable that they've taken on this a different aspect given a sort of relative power of unions in society overall. But anyway, so with that kind of brief overview, I think it's worth going back to what the purpose of the overall report was, or what the aims identified in the report are, and how a works council or industry advisory council, could relate to them. So the objective, as David stated earlier, and as stated in the report, the goal is to build supportive and mutually beneficial communities. And I would imagine that mutually beneficial communities includes mutually beneficial institutions. So then I think the question, it's a fair question, is would an industry advisory council be a mutually beneficial institution, and would it meet the other goals of reducing complexity, advancing security, advancing equity, things like that? One thing that's worth noting is that, again, as I understand it, industry advisory councils would be for the sector, the entire sector, whereas works councils are specific to the employer, and that's another distinction. But I think one of the first issue, I think, with addressing whether or not works councils or industry advisory councils could be mutually beneficial is, can the interests of the employer align significantly with the interests of the employees? Without knowing anything about the respective groups, just from a purely systematic perspective, I don't think it can safely be assumed that the employer's interests would be aligned with those of the employees. In surveys about workers, their most frequently cited concern is regularly job security, whereas the employer, their interest in the security of the sector is only in as much, again, as we can assume, it's only in as much as it increases their profit. So if they can get those profits elsewhere or with a reduced number of workers, that's not really an issue for them, whereas obviously for the employees it is. So I think that sort of on the face of it, you would have to be clear. It's a question of defining the interests, and I think defining them reveals that employers' interests are both veer away from workers' interests and away from the public interest in meaningful ways that would make the councils a difficult place for workers to advocate if there wasn't a way to increase their power relative to employers. And I think that sort of brings up the second point, which is David spoke earlier about addressing the worst impacts of the current circumstance, or attempting to proactively work to make sure that good jobs are present. And again, I think this is another place that would bring up conflicts between workers' interests and employers' interests, because I don't know that it's the employer's interest. Again, isn't really the case that there are good jobs. It's all we can assume is that they want revenue, they want profit, and they want to continue accruing profit. Whereas obviously we can assume that workers, being human beings, will want to have decent employment and a decent life and decent non-harmful emotional states and things like that. And so we can understand and attempt to support that. I think we can understand and attempt to support that and support workers having increased avenues to argue for those things. But it's unclear to me if if industry advisory councils can provide workers with an avenue to express those ideas about what work should look like, what sort of society we want. My concern, I guess, and this is to some degree a question to the other panelists, is David, again, earlier you mentioned technological determinism. And I guess my question would be, if you set up these industry advisory councils that is still within the context of markets and sectors that are primarily defined by profiteering private interests, then would that sort of determinism, even if it's not explicitly technological, would you still get a sort of profiteering determinism that would have an undue influence over the overall structure of the economy as it does now, despite that we've ostensibly introduced this new mechanism for workers' advocacy? That was a bit meandering, so I apologize, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Chuka. And I'm just going to ask the other panelists to put their cameras on. And while they're doing so, I'm just going to sort of summarize. I mean, I think what the panel has done has really delved into, some of the particular recommendations addressing the question of whether a basic income, which can take a variety of forms, is the best mechanism to create a more fair and just society for people in paid work in particular. And so that opens up a variety of other questions, both around labor market attachment and how people might transition in and out of paid work, the desirability of promoting paid work over other forms of work, et cetera. And I'm sure we'll get to some of those questions. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A already. And so I think what I'm going to do is actually start with a question that is quite general and that brings us back to not so much the specific recommendations, for example, related to workers and their rights, but just to the bigger question of the function of a basic income as a policy tool. And then we can also delve into some questions that are a little bit more particular in their focus. So this question asks, do any of the panelists support a basic income for BC? In part, the attraction of the concept is that it would help reduce poverty. Does anyone agree? And if not, what would be the best way to reduce poverty in the province? And so I start with this question in part because I think it asks that kind of overarching question that will help maybe fill in some of the gaps for people who haven't read the report and may not have a strong sense of what the overall recommendations were coming out of the report. So what I might do is just ask David to start, and then both Chuka and Caitlin can kind of weigh in as well. But I'm going to give David the first go at this question as somebody who is directly involved in the research for the report.
All right, thanks, Kendra. We'll start small. So and by the way, I first wanted to say thank you to Caitlin and Chuka. Very thoughtful comments, and I've had conversations with both of them before, and just not a surprise. There's just a lot of meat there. So let me go back to the question. I mean, our answer, the panel's answer was that to center policy on a basic income is not the best way to meet these sort of justice goals that include the poverty goals. We do talk about or recommend sort of targeted basic incomes in some circumstances, but let me go back to the first part of the question. Could a basic income reduce or eliminate poverty? The answer is yes. I mean, it could. The question is that we had in front of us for the most part was, is this the best way to get to where we want to get to as a society? For us, we didn't feel the answer to that was yes as a broad and general statement. Part of that goes back to something that Chuka referenced, which is this question of trying to build community. That a lot of us, part of where we get our feelings of self-respect, part of where we get our feelings of being truly supported come from our communities. A basic income is not, in our minds, a particularly community building policy tool. You give people money and you hope that what they'll then next do is take whatever time that might free up for them to go and build community. It's not clear to us that that's necessarily true. In terms of addressing poverty directly, what we did was try to take the poverty numbers that we had before us and go and look and say, okay, so where is poverty highest? How would you go after that? And this, I don't know if this is widely known. I'm sure it's actually widely known by like Chuka, Kendra, and Caitlin, probably many other people here, but the highest poverty rates right now are for adults, single adults without children. Okay, so families with children, the CCB is doing some decent work on. People over age about 60, 65, you start getting into the federal pension systems. And I'm not saying any of these are fully sufficient. I'm just saying these are, there's some decent work being done by those mechanisms. Couples have a tendency not to be in as extreme poverty. So the group that has the highest rates right now are single adults without children. In that group, about 20% of them work 40 weeks or more a year. And most of them are actually, when you go and look in the data, are women in service sectors in BC, mostly in the lower mainland to a large degree. So for this group, we're saying, here's a group who have strong attachment to the labor market now. Something like an earning subsidy, an effective earning subsidy, unlike the one we have in place now, would provide them with the means to take the work arrangements that they have and do better. But in terms of just income, but what we're interested in is more than just, can we get their income above some poverty line? This is a lot, comes back to what Chuka and Caitlin were talking about. We're talking about trying to create a life with dignity all around. And a huge part of that is what happens in the workforce for people. And therefore, if you really want to talk about the goals we want to get to, our belief is a basic income is a very indirect way to do that. What you're essentially doing is saying, here's the money, now you can walk away from a bad job. And in some sense, and this is back to some of Chuka's last remarks, this is basically saying, we're trusting in the market to discipline the workers. We're saying, or sorry, the firms. We're giving the workers money. The workers will then discipline the firms through the market by essentially withdrawing from situations where they don't like what's going on. It's a very indirect way of trying to make things happen. It wouldn't necessarily lead to that result, because you could end up with an equilibrium where employers recognize that the employees have this backstop and therefore offer even more precarious work arrangements, because there's no reason for them not to. The workers will have this sort of insurance in the background. So it's a sort of a long-winded way of saying we didn't feel that this was the best way to go. And these are some of the reasons that we did that. I'm sorry for being so long-winded.
No, that's okay. And I think it's important to point out, David, that the report does recommend what it equates to targeted basic income programs for particular groups that are improvements on existing social programs and forms of income assistance in particular. Chuka and Caitlin, I'd love to open this up to both of you.
Please go ahead, Caitlin. I'm happy to speak up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, really good question. And I thought I might have to answer this, but I'm answering this as Caitlin, as an individual, because the Worker Solidarity Network and the coalition, at least in the recent meetings I've been in, hasn't come up to a position on this as an organization. So yeah, I mean, we live in a capitalist society that measures our worth, or teaches us that our worth is to be measured in terms of our contributions that look like paid labor, that contribute to the economy. And wouldn't it be nice and lovely if this wasn't always the case? And if people's different contributions, including unpaid labor that is outside of the economy, that is a socially constructed economy, our unpaid labor in terms of caring for elders and caring for loved ones when they're ill and raising human beings, if that was valued as well, not just our contributions to the economy, or if our contributions to our community in volunteering was something that we were taught is valued, or developing ourselves and pursuing education for the sake of education, and not not just for the job that we get at the end. And I know that's idealistic, and but that's that. I just want to say that wouldn't it be nice if that was the case? And so for that reason, I do support forms of basic income that allow that to happen. And right now, and I think the report did a really great job at showing this with the review. So much of our social safety net is based on one's contribution to paid work over time, and accessing EI and CPP and extended health and dental benefits. So much of that is predicated on our how we engage with paid labor, and was designed, at the time when many of our pillars of labor law also were designed when the standard employment relationship was the norm, and uses that as the kind of access point to much of social safety net that is employment based. So I'll end there.
Yeah, to quote the Beach Boys and paraphrase Caitlin, wouldn't it be nice if we could wake up? I also think that, or I as speaking as an individual, I don't especially support UBI, but I just think I think a preferable idea is just the direct provision of goods and services and resources to people for a number of reasons, many of which Caitlin and David have mentioned already. I think that UBI still gives profiteers a significant amount of power or opportunity to extract. If people are still purchasing resources from private retailers, then you're just funneling public money into private hands at an even greater rate than we already do. I think as well, ultimately, the goal is the elimination of money and the elimination of the monetization of interpersonal relationships and interactions. So as far as we can get away from that, I think would be ideal. But I think Caitlin's point about self-actualization is especially important. If we don't talk about it really, but I think it's often alarming how our lives are structured entirely around our jobs, and that ends up being how we understand our existence, as if it's a necessary component of it, or as if it's, I don't know, I think the almost existential domination of our identities and the experience of being alive by wage labor employment has been disastrous. And so I think eliminating its influence as much as possible is a goal.
Great, thank you. Somehow I don't think those were in the sort of mandate letter that those ideas were not in the mandate letter that David and his panel received from the government. But in a way, that's the point, is the way in which this report can be a jumping off point for these broader conversations about both policy solutions, but also ultimately how we understand a just society, to David's introductory points. And on that, I'm going to go to what was actually the first question that was asked, which ties basic income to the question of a net zero transition in our economy in relation to the challenge of climate change, because I think this has been a context in which UBI has often been discussed. And so the question is a bit of a longer one, so just bear with me for a moment while I read it. So fossil fuel workers are not the only ones impacted by Canada's net zero carbon emission targets. The transition to a low carbon economy is going to impact us all. If we're going to meet these targets, we must recognize that green livelihoods, income security, and community resilience are interconnected. A basic income guarantee for every adult 18 to 64 who needs it would provide both income security and local economic stimulus, helping people to stay in their communities and supporting community resilience. A guaranteed annual livable income for all Canadians, including Indigenous peoples, was included in the calls for justice in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, and is prominently featured in their newly released action plan to implement the calls for justice. So, given all of those things, what role could, and I realize, David, that some of these specific questions were somewhat out with the remit of the report itself, but So in that sense, this is, again, really a question for all of you. Do you see the basic income in this sense as a piece of addressing these broader challenges that maybe go beyond just poverty reduction? And anyone can start.
I can speak to this quickly. So I absolutely agree that in any consideration for a Green New Deal, just transition, that sort of thing, transitioning to a zero emission economy, both workers' livelihoods, but then also communities' livelihoods, and including recognition of where they are, and requiring that, or recognizing that requiring people to relocate is not precisely humane. I think it's absolutely important to make sure that support is provided to people both where they are, and support is provided to enable people to make whatever changes in their life they seek. I think that in some instances, it likely is the case in some instances that either direct payouts are requested by a community, which I would obviously not disagree with, or it's kind of if it's requested by a community, then I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think, for example, if there is a community that's being especially impacted, that a certain industry in that community is affected by climate change and so plummets, and the economic opportunities in the community disappear, I think it's incumbent upon the government to create economic opportunities in the community in addition to providing support. So sort of with all things, I don't think it's sufficient for the government to provide support in only monetary means. If they do that, I think support has to be more material and present as well where people are.
Do you want to go next, Caitlin, or pointing at me? I completely appreciate the question. Honestly, it is something that we talked about. It's something that is hard to get anything that looks like empirical evidence on, not surprisingly. And to me, I think the reason that we came down where we came down was because the UBI, if you want to call it that, whichever version of it you want to talk about, is a very non-intentional way of going about this problem, which I think is just a reframing of what you could just said. It's not clear to me why one would necessarily, okay, and this is, again, back to what both Shuka and Caitlin have said. In the context of the economy that we live, if one provides a basic income to people, is the next thing that's going to happen that they are going to support community and stay in the places that we're worried about, where the resource jobs are leaving? Or would they use it as the basis for making some other shift? The idea that it would necessarily support and enhance communities, to me, is an act of faith that I don't understand. I have not seen any empirical evidence to support. It's a big act of faith. And we know that there are lots of evidence out there that suggests that when one turns to monetary and market-based approaches, and let's be clear, that's what we're doing. We're telling people we're going to give you money and hope that that allows you to behave in the market in a certain way that allows to build community. For the most part, we see the opposite, right? So the most famous one, probably everybody knows this one, is the example of the pricing of dropping your child off late at the daycare in Haifa, right? Everyone know this one. So basically, this daycare, they found they were having trouble with the parents dropping their children off late, okay, after 5 o'clock. So they said, okay, from now on, there's going to be a price for dropping your child off after 5 o'clock. And what happened? The amount of dropping off went up, not down, because people now thought, okay, now I understand this is the price. This is the relationship that we now have. Instead of me being worried about the daycare workers who have to stay overtime, I know that, in fact, I'm paying for this. And then, having seen that, the daycare took away that price, and it stayed. The overtime problem actually stayed at the worst, higher level. What you did was you shifted the social norms in that circumstance. And I think that's something that needs to be questioned here rather than accepted. And I understand completely where this is coming from. I'm completely on board with the goals that are being stated. It's just, to me, I would rather take policies that are intentional about meeting those goals instead of handing people money and hoping that the outcome is community. I don't see the empirical basis for that conclusion.
Thanks, David. Caitlin, did you want to say anything on this question?
Just to thank the person who put it in. Honestly, I felt after reading the report almost like, you know, a pot on the stove that needed a little more time to cook while I absorbed in everything from the report. And this question has kind of pulled my brain in a different direction too. Thank you.
Great. So I now have a question that is in a way a little bit more possibly technical, I guess, in nature, but that is interesting in the context of the policy questions that this is trying to address. And it's a two-part question. So the first part is, first, while we rightly discuss economic inequality, has there been any research on income volatility in BC, which could be relevant to thinking about the distributive effects of basic income in relation to income stability? And I'll just say quickly, I think this is a really interesting question in relation to a broader definition of precarious work that isn't just about gig work. Because for workers who experience a lot of uncertainty around their hours and are subject to the kind of just-in-time scheduling that Caitlin mentioned, this income volatility could be a big piece. And then the second part of the question is, are there any institutions in the province tracking or studying income and demographic data related to the growth of ride-hailing services and app-based delivery? So I think this question is partly about, you know, to the points made earlier to do with the prevalence of gig work and sort of technological determinism in how we understand problems in the labor market. Do we even know how big a problem this is in order to be able to assess whether a basic income is the solution for workers in this position? And again, I'll open it up to any of you. David, you might be able to answer the first part on income volatility, but Chuka or Caitlin, you may also know something about this as well.
I mean, the short answer to the first question is there are ways that this is measured. So for example, one sort of common way is to think about dividing earnings up into quintiles and then looking at what's the probability that a person moves from, say, the lowest fifth of the earnings distribution to the next fifth up in a year later. We have some of those that track over time. And what you see in that over time is that those measures went up in the 1990s, in the really bad labor markets of the late 1990s, and then stayed fairly stable since then. So the way I usually think about a lot of these things is we had a problem of, we had some really terrible labor markets in the 90s that established some pretty bad levels. And the policies that have been put in place since, some of which are very, you know, we've got to get rid of regulations, all the things that Caitlin talked about, which were supposed to, in principle, I think from some of the people who put them in, thought they were going to fix these problems, did not. At the same time, some of the income support systems that we've, you know, first we stripped away and now have been gradually putting some of them back, that hasn't seemed to make a dent. This is back to Chuka's point, like we need something, you know, really substantial to crack this. But we do have measures. They are fairly flat in the last decade or so, but they're much worse than flat. They have jumped a whole level in the last few decades.
Chuka or Caitlin, did either of you want to either say anything about income volatility or just about, and Chuka, I know you've been involved in some research on this, the sort of impact of you know, ride hailing and kind of app-based work?
So I can say we did a bit of, yes, we have done a bit of research into ride hailing and more generally into how automation could be affecting labor and workers in the province. Regarding gig workers specifically, in terms of income, I haven't seen reports on volatility like week to week, but I have seen StatsCan data showing that the majority of people who report a significant portion of their income, up to a majority of their income, as coming from gig work, they are in the sort of bottom two quintiles of the economic scale, and primarily in the bottom one. So people, the higher a portion of your income comes from gig work, the less you made overall, which I think represents fundamental insecurity in the regularity of work. But regarding income generally in the province, one thing that we found in our study, which I thought was quite notable, is that we made three buckets of groups, three buckets of employment categories. The first being like sort of interpersonal, manual, technical work. The second being kind of analysis or industrial work, industrial or manufacturing, things like that. The second category being jobs which have the longest histories of unionization. And the third was abstract, technical, conceptual work. And we found that in each group, the gap between the median wage and the average wage was increasing. The average wage was rising. So in each group, in each employment category, there was income inequality increasing, as well as income inequality increasing across the employment groups. So that isn't, I wouldn't say that that's exactly volatility, but I do think it represents a vulnerability in the income trends in the province.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Caitlin, did you want to say anything about either of those issues?
Just maybe to elaborate on the point about data and the need for more data on people and the number of people who are in the ride hailing or platform gig economies. I think we also need more data on that captures the enforcement gap around misclassification overall and employee misclassification. When people are told by their boss they're an independent contractor when in fact they shouldn't be. And then thinking about that exclusions piece of the ESA too, we also need data on how many people are working in paid work in BC right now who are excluded from the ESA, whether it be because of the occupation they're in or excluded from the specific, provisions. I think we really need the picture of that as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to sort of, because we're getting a little bit short on time, I'm going to sort of combine two questions that kind of get at similar and related but slightly separate issues. So the first one is, what are the panel's thoughts on a basic income as a treatment for complicated welfare disability systems and homelessness, as opposed to mostly being an alternative to poor employment practices? And I'm going to combine this with a question that follows it, which is, what is the solution for a basic income for those who have worked in precarious employment, but are no longer able to and fall through the cracks of disability systems and are not yet seniors? So these are sort of both questions that relate to that piece of more insecure labor market attachment, or people with barriers to employment. And there's quite a lot about this in the report. So I'll open it up to all three of you, whoever wants to speak first to just say something about this.
Can you restate the first one, Kendra?
Yeah, sorry about that. That's the danger with combining questions. So the first part was specifically about basic income as a treatment for complicated welfare, disability systems, and homelessness. So the first part was about the complexity of those systems and maybe a lack of accessibility. And then the second part was this question of people who fall through the cracks. So would basic incomes be a solution for those people who are not being served well by these existing programs, or potentially by the paid labor market?
So, I mean, I'll start with the first one. The basic income in relationship to supports for people living with disabilities is an interesting topic because in part, so let me first say, there's a version of basic income that exists in the States which virtually doesn't exist here, which is that a basic income would wipe out all other policies, and everyone would be sent to the market. I don't know of any sensible person who's in favor of a basic income in Canada. Well, I guess that would be defined and definitional. But anyway, I don't know anyone who's pushing a basic income in Canada who takes that approach at all. One of the things that comes up often that is used as a criticism of people who are in support of basic income is people say, but what about people living with disability? This sort of common, give everybody the same check is not going to work. And typically the answer is yes, you're right. We are not proposing that. What we're proposing is there will be a separate system or at least a separate amount of money for people living with disabilities. In other words, most actual basic income policies that are being proposed do not do not undo the disability systems as we know them. They essentially leave them in place. And so a lot of what we did was try to understand, if when we're going to bring in a basic income or even not, how do you think about the systems for people with disability and how would it integrate? And our recommendation in that area is sort of long, but it essentially amounts to an actual basic income. So right now, what happens if you're living with a disability is we consign you to an income that keeps you permanently below the poverty line. So the first step is a basic income at the poverty line at least. The second is what we heard a lot talking with people in the disability community was a desire to work, but a feeling like the whole system was set up to in some way catch them or keep them from working. And so a lot of our recommendations are about trying to make it possible to provide support for work, not require it, but to try to provide it, and to provide much clearer rules that relate to who actually is on disability. So a lot of that was sort of like, okay, this is something that's actually set aside in the basic income debate. Let's go in and look at it and try to figure out a way to deal with what is always a complex system, I'm afraid.
I can say that I think that it seems to me that this basic income proposal focuses primarily on the output. Like the government is giving people money. Once it has paid out once it has made those payments, it's effectively its work is done. I think, especially in regards to complicated situations, focusing on the outcome is more important. So if the outcome that you're focusing on, say, is that everybody has housing, then if you focus on that and do whatever it takes to make sure everyone gets housing, then you've reached that situation. Whereas if you just identify how much housing should cost and give everyone that money, it's very unlikely that everyone will ultimately get housing at the end of it, because who knows what would happen. So I think that if you focus on the outcomes and develop systems that ensure that no one can fall through the cracks. So nobody is without sufficient food and a very nutritional diet. Nobody's without adequate healthcare or medication. No one is without housing, all of those things. Then nobody can fall through the cracks fundamentally, because there aren't any cracks to fall through. Obviously, it would take quite a bit more, I guess, than what what we typically provide. But I think that would, solve the issues, hopefully. So.
Caitlin, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think, we know there are so many ways that how our work is designed and organized systemically discriminates against people with disabilities and people living with mental health challenges. And so I think, from the report, I learned a lot about the current kind of challenges with disability supports, including, how, the confusion. I think what's really striking is that map that was created. I don't know if I could put a link to it, but that map that was in the report, you clicked on it and it brought you to this circle showing the web of programs that people have to navigate and how exhausting that must be. That really just struck me. So I think in the report, it outlined like overhauling existing programs and having those targeted group supports where they aren't there to support people with addiction and mental health challenges, really important. So if you could check out that map, it's really quite striking and shows the level of bureaucracy and messiness that currently exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that a really powerful representation in the report. So we're at 1:15, so I'm going to need to wrap things up. We have some other really excellent questions. I'll just say very quickly, a number of people asking, what evidence is there that people with a basic income will not pursue community? So in other words, just because we don't have the evidence the empirical evidence, which can be difficult actually on around community building, doesn't mean it won't happen. And also, you know, to Caitlin and Chuka and David's point in the last question, the possible value of a basic income in just destigmatizing poverty and program use. So that's also a question. I'm sorry we don't have time to discuss those, but I want to be respectful of people's time, including our panelists. So I just want to thank all three of you again for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've learned a lot from this discussion. And thank you to our participants, and please do look out for the recording and feel free to share it with others who were not able to attend. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kendra.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.